Thanks, Keisha.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Quick poll. How many of you are currently doing any type of work using an Agile method, either Scrum, extreme programming, dynamic system development, anything like that? How many of you? Just raise your hand. I'm just curious. Come on, Kim, you got to raise your hand at least.
We talk about it.
Oh, you talk about it a lot. Oh, well, you know. Actually, that's a very interesting one. So Kanban is not directly an Agile method, if you will, but it uses the same principles. So actually, one of the things that is interesting to look at, and a lot of the Agile concepts, if you will, they're coming out of more generic framework called lean development. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to give you this morning a little bit of an overview as to how you might work as a BA within an Agile environment and exactly what that would mean if you worked within that environment. I'm not going to go. I have a lot of slides here. We can talk about this for 2.5 days, 3 days, 4 days. We can probably talk about it for a week. And I'm not going to go bore you to death with a whole bunch of PowerPoint slides. I want to have a conversation about what you can do as project managers, as business analysts, to make your software projects be more successful, for your teams to be more productive, and for you to deliver your solutions to your clients hopefully much faster. I mean, that's really the ultimate goal of what we're trying to achieve. So forget about, worrying about Scrum and Scrum practices and Agile. They're very important because they help you, but don't worry about them initially. Think about what you're trying to achieve. At the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to develop solutions for your clients, whoever they are, quickly. You want to make sure the solution does what it is supposed to do, and you want your teams to do it as fast as they can to be as productive as they can. So all we're trying to do with a lot of the principles is figure out how can we as software teams be more productive. And a lot of the work that's been done in the Agile world actually stems from some work that was done in the 80s and early 90s with lean development and new product development. It's actually a very famous article that was written by two Japanese researchers about the new product development game in the Harvard Business Review. But that sort of started a lot of that work by two people that actually happened to work with Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber many years ago. This was in the early to mid 90s. But here's what we want to do. Think about a typical software project. What are some things that are causing us not to be as productive as possible?
Agreement on what it is that they need.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at need, if you look at the goal of the project, if you look at requirements, which is obviously for the BAs among you, one of your, the key things you want to do look at, not knowing what you're building is one of the biggest stumbling blocks. I mean, it's causing us a lot of heartburn all around if you think about it, right? I mean, if you're BA, if you're typical waterfall, type of approach, you're supposed to go and find all the requirements up front. And that's, by the way, very helpful because if you know the requirements up front, you can come to an agreement what you're going to build. It's a heck of a lot easier to estimate what you're trying to build because you know what you're building. But why do we still fail with the waterfall environment?
Because when they look at the system, they don't agree with what.
Yeah, exactly. The biggest problem is this. We presume that we can find all the requirements up front. So we make a couple of different assumptions, right? We assume, first of all, that the requirements are knowable, which is not always the case because we might pretend that the users know what they want, but they may even tell us they know what they want. But they don't necessarily know what they want, or they're not sure what they can have, or new things will emerge once the development gets underway. So one issue we have is that requirements are not necessarily knowable up front, and the requirements that we do know might not necessarily be stable. So one of the things I always put up is that requirements are perishable. and you may have heard me say that before, I always look at requirements a lot like lettuce and tomatoes, you know. You probably heard me say this analogy before. You wouldn't purchase 6 months worth or a year's worth of salad supplies today, because you know by the time you get to make the salad, the lettuce and tomatoes and everything else will wilt it. Well, requirements a lot like that. You really would have a very hard time trying to collect by 6 months or a year's worth of requirements, because by the time you get to use them, in other words, you get to implement them, they may have become stale. They may have changed. You may realize that you don't need them. You may realize that they're not really helpful. So now suddenly you've spent a lot of time documenting requirements, analyzing requirements, building models, having lots of conversations with your users about requirements that by the time you get to build them are no longer valid. That's a heck of a lot of waste of time. So one of the things that we have in the lean world is this whole notion of waste, potential waste that we have, and very important to eliminate waste. So if you think about Agile and Scrum and a lot of these other methods, big overarching philosophy or motto: find and eliminate waste. Try to find activities that don't really help you be as productive as possible, that get in your way, and reduce them. So here's what you got to do. When you start thinking about Agile, first thing you want to do is you want to figure out what are some of your wasteful activities and try to reduce them over time and then eventually eliminate them. By the way, very hard to do. Really hard to do in some cases. Let's talk about some of these wasteful activities. One wasteful activity we just talked about. If you try to get all your requirements up front, that's potentially wasteful. Now, I'm being very careful here, by the way. I'm saying potentially, because there are a lot of projects where the requirements are really well defined. In that case, finding them up front and using them to come up with a very specific project proposal and a very good estimate and a very good schedule is feasible. There are not a lot of projects like that, but there are some like that. But in most cases, finding the requirements all up front is very, very difficult. Or having a full agreed upon scope up front is very, very difficult. And it's not for lack of trying, remember. It's because some of the requirements are unknowable by definition. They may not emerge until later, and some might change by the time you get to it, simply because time elapses and the environment, the marketplace, the business place, your clients' needs, your customers' needs, your faculty's needs, they change. What are some other potentially wasteful activities that we currently do that might reduce our team's productivities, might reduce your productivities?
Having the wrong stakeholders.
Having the wrong stakeholders, absolutely. I'm going to add to that, not having any stakeholders in the room, right? The other part here is no contact with users, or little, I should say. The people who actually are going to use the product you're building for them, if you can't talk to them, that's wasteful. What are some other potential wasteful activities? I'll throw one at you. What about team size? How many of you are working on teams that have 20, 30, 40 people in them? No, as you don't work in projects like that, or no, that's wasteful?
Our team is too small.
Our team's too small.
Right.
Well, then you actually are more lucky than the opposite, because at least with two people, it may take long to do because you don't have enough resources, but at least you're not wasting a lot of time. What happens if you have very large teams is that you think you're getting more work done, but you really don't. In fact, sort of the cutoff point is about 9 people. There's been a lot of studies done on that look at productivity of teams when you go above 9. And every study, same thing. Once you get to about, 9, 10, 11 people, take an 11-person team or a 12-person team. and compare it against the productivity of a 7-person team. Which is more productivity? The 7-person team. So building teams larger than about 9 is very wasteful. Why? Too much over communication, management, right? Coordination is very difficult. So basically coordination and trying to coordinate large teams can be a very wasteful activity. Because remember, you're coordinating, you're not really producing value for your client. At the end of the day, always remember, how does your client judge you? Yeah, does it work? Does it solve a problem? Does it work? Then they give a flying hoot about how many people you had on it, what programming language you picked, you know, within broad strokes, sometimes they care. But they often really don't care about how you get it done. Just get it done. By the way, of course, you know the old adage, right? We also talked about small project teams. First of all, you got the 80-20 rule, right? We've got to keep that in mind, that 80-20 rule. That's actually a very important part, too, that you don't want to waste a lot of time thinking about the small 20%. You don't want to think about the outliers. You already want to think about those 20% of the requirements, the key goals that are going to solve 80% of the need. What I was thinking about is we're behind on time. We've got to get the thing done faster. So, well, why don't we just go add more people? Right? And we know exactly what the outcome is. And by the way, we've known about this outcome now for about 60 years. Notice and my apologies to other project managers, what do many project managers still do after 60 years of knowledge? They add more people. Which accomplishes exactly the opposite of what you're trying to do. Every software project, when you add people, that is, software project is late. Obviously, if you add it very early at the very beginning, it's a different story. Assuming that you don't cross that magic bound of around 7, 8, 9. Try to stay below that. You add more people to your software project, and invariably, it takes even longer. And by the way, why does it take longer? I mean, after all, if you add more sheetrock hanging, people to a construction project or more guys sticking a ditch, the ditch gets stuck faster. How come we can't do this with us? Interactions. We have interactions, right? Ditch diggers don't have to interact very much. You start here, I start here, we work independently. But unfortunately, the kind of work that we do is not independent. We have to coordinate. And it takes a while for someone to become familiar with the project and be able to contribute. What are some other wasteful activities?
Documentation for documentation's sake. I knew you were going to say that. So
I'm going to get to that at some point in time, yes. So there are two big ones up there, right? And they're actually both connected. Documentation has a very, very important role on software projects. It is a manifest of the knowledge that you've acquired. And you're using it to communicate, typically through documents, among different team members. The typical issue is that if you have knowledge that you've acquired, if 2 parties or 3 parties need to know about that knowledge, about the piece of information, and they're not all present at the same time, you've got a problem. So the way we solve it typically is that, well, if, you find the information, but Ray's not coming on board for another 2 or 3 months down the line, what do? You write it down, so eventually you can give him the document and he can read it. That's the way that you transfer the information. So documentation is very valuable if you're not there at the same point in time. But what's the potential drawback to documentation? It takes a long time to write and is subject to interpretation. So you listen to the knowledge, you interpret what somebody's saying, you write it down. Now you give it to Ray. Ray reads your words, he's trying to interpret what you meant. So that can be a problem. So what we're trying to do is 2 things. Again, we're coming back to this overall large philosophical motto, try to eliminate waste. Documentation for documentation's sake does not add to the final value of the product. So eliminate it. But then you also got to deal with how do you communicate important knowledge. Well, one practice that a lot of Agile teams try to adopt is what's called co-location. They try to work in, they take a room like this, everybody works in the same room. I know it's sometimes very hard logistically to do. I'm not sure if you have thought about this yet with your teams, if they're co-located. Have you thought about that? Some. But co-location is a very important benefit. It allows everyone to hear the same information at the same time, and if they have to share information because they're all in the same room, it's a heck of a lot easier to share than one person writing it down and another person interpreting that written communication. So co-location is one of those things that helps you become more productive because you eliminate the wastefulness of excessive documented communication. By the way, it comes back down to where lean is coming from, when a lot of the Agile is coming from. It comes from manufacturing originally. And one of the things you do in manufacturing is you eliminate what's called transport time, moving things from one place to another. Now, we don't move a lot of things. I mean, we deal with information and knowledge and data and so on. But moving that around can be wasteful. It's our equivalent of moving machinery or parts around. So the less you can move it, the better off you are. So those are some of the things that you want to look at when you are working on an Agile project. What can you do? What practices can you follow? What things can you install that will help you find wasteful activities and then eliminate them? Now, some of these things are very hard to do. I mean, think about it, right? So, co-location. We just talked about this, right? It's very hard to do. You got to find rooms. Most companies, real estate isn't built that way. We're built around having offices, having cubes. Everybody has their own personal space. So suddenly having a place where everybody works together is very difficult to find. I'm not sure how it is here, but I'm a Northeastern, and finding a conference room, it's difficult. Finding any place where you can meet is very difficult. Everybody's always space constrained. I do some work at some other companies. I do some work at a financial company these days, and I'm actually helping them adopt Scrum and adopting them more iterative practices. To find team space is extremely difficult. It's a company of like 5,000 people have 2 team spaces. I mean, it's unbelievable to think about it, but it's the way it is, because when you have a waterfall environment where you do things sequentially, you don't need it. And so suddenly when you work in a different way, then you suddenly find that it's very difficult to accomplish that. Now let's talk about one more thing here. So most organizations, particularly that are I'm going to say this in a weird way, real software companies. So a real software company, like, take Facebook, or Google, or, Microsoft. They're product-centric. There's basically a team that's the Windows 10 team. There's a team that's the, Facebook ad team. There's a team that's the Facebook analytics team. There's a team that's the Facebook timeline team. Every team has a particular product that they work on. And that team stays together for often a pretty significant amount of time, often several years. Very hard for you to do because your projects kind of come and they go and they come and they go. So most of the organizations that I work with that are non-software companies tend to use a pool model. You've got a pool of business analysts, you've got a pool of project managers, you've got a pool of developers with different specialties, you've got a pool of user experience designers, a pool of testers, and then once you have the pool, what do you do when you have a project? You start picking, right? We need, 1 BA, we need 2 developers, we need a project manager, and you start picking, you're assembling some kind of a, virtual team, if you will. How many of you work on one project and one project only? Exactly. So what happens often is that, of course, you get assigned to multiple projects. Mostly because if you just were assigned to one project, 2 things would happen. A, you may not be fully utilized. And after all, we don't want Yale to pay you for not working a full 40 hours a week. That would be, terrible, God forbid. And secondly, If you don't start working on the project right away and you tell your client, you know what, we're busy right now, we'll get to that in 2 weeks, or in 3 weeks, or in 3 months, or in 6 months, what happens? Yeah, 2 days later you get a call from the provost's office. Right? Exactly. Somebody's going to be unhappy somewhere. And, they're going to start, calling, hey, they're not working on my project. So what do we often do? Well, we assembled yet another team where you're working now 5% of your time per week on that project, and you're working 15% of your time on that project, right? But you start working on the project right away. You're getting something done. You start meeting with them, you start writing some documentation, and so on. What does that have to do with waste? Creates tremendous amount of waste, incredible amounts of waste. Why? Task switching. Yeah, transition time, context switching time, whatever you want to call it, right? There's tremendous overhead in dropping one project or one task and then picking up another one. Now, obviously, we have to do this several times per day because we're trying to keep multiple clients happy. Recent study came out last year. What's the drop in productivity if you're task switching between 2 different tasks? Anybody happen to remember what read the article? It's a staggering 40%. It's about 40%. Do you know what the productivity drop-off is for working on 5 or more projects? Again, this is a real study. 95%. It basically means that you're getting nothing done. That's essentially what that means. It basically means the majority of your day is wasted in transitioning. And you've been there, right? I mean, you've gone to one meeting, you're getting all gung-ho about it, and then you're like, well, I really can't work on this now, I've got to go to another meeting. Then eventually, a few hours later, maybe a couple days later, you get back together with the team again. So, what we were talking about last time, can we just rehash for a little bit? And you spend the majority of the meeting rehashing what you did last time. And you keep spinning, it was like a little hamster, you keep spinning your wheels on the same thing. And you're getting a few minutes worth of real work done. Remember, 95% means that you're getting about, did the math once, about 25 to 30 minutes worth of work done per day. And by the way, when looking at many of you, that's probably a productive day. You've been there, right? I mean, you're running around all day long. At the end of the day, you were exhausted, you were very busy, and you look and you say, I got nothing done. That's because you're wasting a lot of the time in context switching. So one of the things you want to do, and by the way, I'm happy to hear you mention Kanban, because one of the things you want to do is you want to eliminate exactly that. So Kanban uses a very similar strategy of what's called limiting work in progress. Scrum does it, Kanban does it. They have a slightly different way of doing it. But both of them do the same thing. You limit the amount of irons you have in the fire. And you work on one task at a time until it's done. Or until it's blocked and you're waiting for somebody else to do something. Obviously, you know, at that point in time when you're waiting for input from somebody else, you can go off and pick up another task. But the key thing is that you want to try to start a task and work it for as long as possible. Now again, very difficult to do. Because when you think about this, you're ticking off a client. Now you're telling a client, hey, I'm busy. I'll get to you in, about 2 days. Can't do that. But what you want to at least try to do is increase your batch size, if you will. So work on a task for 2, 3, 4, 5 days of hours. Maybe for an entire day. Maybe split up your week into project days. Monday we'll work on this project. Tuesday we'll work on that project. Wednesday and Thursday we'll work on that project. Friday we don't work on any project. We'll do all the stuff that fell through the cracks, right? All the stuff that you got to do, the small one-off things that we all have to do. But the more you eliminate the context switching, the task switching, the more you eliminate waste. Increases productivity. And that's because you can't be product-centric here. Or at least most of you can't be. Very hard to say, hey, I only work on this one particular product for that one particular group. Extremely hard to do for most of you.
What makes it hard, too, Martin, is when you're in a support role.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're working on a project,
yeah,
but you're also trying to fulfill a support role,
yep. Yeah.
You just get that unknown, like you come
you
in
do.
the morning and say, I'm going to work on this, and all of a sudden there's 10 emails with
yes.
problems that you have to drop what you're doing and
yep.
start looking into.
Yep. That's a really good point. So one of the things that you need to do is you need to basically plan for unplanned work, which is really a really weird way of saying it, but you got to think about what can we do with unplanned work. So for example, what you could do is you could say, I will dedicate every day from 9 to 11 to unplanned work. Now what happens if your unplanned work takes over your planned work? Yeah, you're falling behind. You got a different problem. Now you got to look to see what can we do to eliminate the unplanned work. Maybe you have a system that you're supporting that is broken. You might then be much better off to say, you know what, I'm stopping all projects right now. I'm going to that trouble system that's causing me to have a lot of unplanned work every day, and I'll fix that. Because if you don't, what's going to happen? You're going to get more unplanned work, and it's going to disrupt it. You're not making forward progress. So while that may be very painful to do because you say, well, you're not doing any new work, you're not, responding to the clients, you work on some old system, you should have fixed that before, it's your fault because there's so many bugs in it. Well, so what? If I don't fix it, I can never go forward. I just keep spinning my wheels. It's a great book, by the way. I know that Roseanne, when she was here, she made some of you read it, The Phoenix Project. Remember that one? If you haven't read it, it's a really, really good book to read because it talks about exactly that problem and how to fix it. And by the way, we use Kanban to solve the problem. Did you end up reading it, Kim?
I haven't read it.
Haven't read it. I think it's a great book. It doesn't take long to read. You can read it in a couple of days.
What is it called?
It's called The Phoenix Project. Let me write it up here.
That'd be great.
I know it's a Kindle, available on Kindle, so for those of you who have Kindle, it's pretty easy. It's an IT project management, Kanban, Scrum, how to eliminate, waste type of book, but it's written not as a typical textbook, but as a novel. So it takes a project and sort of a fictitious company and kind of shows you all the people, how the interactions go. It's a very neat case study and a very neat way of presenting the problem and a bunch of really neat solutions. So highly recommend it. So now we talked about this. Let's go think more about, and this being a BA forum, what do we do as BAs? How do we work as BAs in this environment? And how does your work differ when you're a typical BA? So first thing that's very different. You are dedicated to the project from beginning to end. By the way, by that I don't mean necessarily on one project. It would be nice, but it's not going to happen. All right, so we kind of gotta already sort of take a step back and say, in your environment, a lot of the environment I work in, I will never have the luxury of working on one project at a time. But what I will try to do is I will try to eliminate as much waste as I can, knowing it will never be as productive as a team that's fully dedicated. You simply are saying, I will go ahead and take a hit in productivity by being more responsive to my clients. And that's just the way it is. But what you would definitely want to do as a BA is increase batch time. So one important thing you want to do right away that comes out of this, if you have a requirements meeting or an interview or a brainstorming session with one of your stakeholders, one of your users, so let's say the interview takes an hour, do not schedule anything for 2 hours afterwards. So basically simply say a 1 hour meeting, or so a 1 hour interview, will require a 3 hour time block of my time. Why? Analyze. That's exactly right. Right afterwards, you want to analyze, write everything down, and do all the work. Do not do what we often do, jump onto another meeting, do something else, jump into a conference call, and then come back, and I'll come back to it later. Because you know what's going to happen, right? You forget, it's gone. And now you got to, I can't remember. Now you got to reread your notes. You're going to make another call. Very, very, very difficult. So that's one of the first, most important things you want to do as a BA, to work in that environment. Spend a lot more block time doing your work. The other thing that's different. How about your requirements? How do we solve the other problem that our requirements are perishable? And finding them all up front is potentially very wasteful. In the salad analogy. You buy a whole bunch of lettuce and tomato a year in advance, all you're going to do is throw it out. You're wasting a whole bunch of money. Exactly. Start doing. What were you saying?
Only buy what you're going to eat this week.
That's exactly what you. That's exactly the right approach. You do a little bit at a time. This is very difficult because it leads to a bunch of other problems, right? So one thing you got to remember, you are trading one set of problems for another set of problems. So one thing that you got to always keep in mind is that Agile solves a lot of problems, but it also introduces some other issues that you have to then deal with. So let's go talk about this for a little bit, right? So you buy a week's worth of salad, which means for us, we only analyze, we only find the requirements for a short burst of development. Let me go pick up a picture here. So what we're trying to do in an Agile environment is to work more iteratively. So Agile is one of the iterative methods. And by the way, I keep throwing Agile, iterative, and Scrum into the mix here. Let's just take a minute and sidestep here for a second and just define them. So iterative means that you work in cycles versus working in stages. Waterfall works in stages. You have an analysis stage, a planning stage, you have an analysis stage, a design stage, a coding stage, a testing stage, and then you're done with your product. And the idea is that you finish one stage before you move on to the next stage. So in a waterfall environment, the assumption would be that the BA or group of BA would define all the requirements, build a comprehensive requirements package, BRD or some kind of requirement specification, that then can be handed to a team of designers or architects who can then architect the solution, define it completely, hand it off to a set of developers, either onshore or offshore, who can then wander off by themselves and completely build a product without having to talk to you ever again. Don't laugh. That's the theory, remember? And then eventually you throw it off to a bunch of testers, and the testers now have a well-defined spec, a well-defined set of test plans they get from the analysis. They can then test the code against it, and a wonderful product pops out at the end.
You missed the part where the BA keeps jumping in and fixing things.
No, that doesn't, no, Mary Ann, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen because the requirements are so well defined here and they don't change, so there is no issue here. Jeez. Yeah, exactly. The problem, of course, is, right, that this doesn't work in practice. And it doesn't work, by the way, for a very important part. The requirements are perishable. They change. And the assumption is we found them all up front, which we also know is not possible. So this, by definition, is broken. This can never work. Has never worked. By the way, we insist that it does work and we keep doing it, but that's, different issue. Side note, does anybody know why we have that method? Well, no. We pretend you get better cost estimates. You pretend that this is correct, so now you pretend that you can't estimate it, and then you pretend you have a budget. But of course, we all know that the budget never really materializes, the time never materializes, but we pretend it did. Why do we have it, by the way? We know it doesn't work. We've known for 50 years it doesn't work. But why do we have it to begin with?
Well, it seems like it would be, if you're the DA working on analysis, once you're done, you're done.
Yeah.
You pass it on.
Yeah.
It's like,
Something else.
it seems like it's a assembly line.
That's exactly right, because the analogy comes from the assembly. This is what's called a push model. A push model is that everybody pushes the work forward to the next stage. Winston Royce, I got to be very careful about the two. Winston Royce in the 70s wrote a paper, and I forget what the exact title is. I think it's called the Waterfall Model of Software Development or Software Development or whatever. I have the paper on my laptop. I can show you. We can go take a look at it. I always send this as a reading to all my students every semester. But it's a paper that was written and defined how we do software engineering. He basically said that, and now you got to remember, this is late 1960s, early 1970s. I wasn't around as a developer, but they tell me that well, actually, I used to for 1 year when I was in college. Punch cards. So now remember, back then, a computer could run one program at a time. There was no such thing as multitasking or multi-user login or anything like that. You brought a stack of punch cards to a computer room where people in white coats would then take your program on punch cards, put them into a box, and then they tell you, well, you know what, it looks like you're going to get some computer time tomorrow. So check back with us on Monday to go see a result. So eventually they would feed it in. They work 24 hours a day. They would feed it in. They would read in the cards. The computer would run. Then it would print an output out. It would put it in your box. And on Monday morning, you would go pick up the computer output. Did you want to go make a syntax error in your code? No, 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 no. A logic error? No. What do you want to do? You want to spend a lot of time analyzing and a lot of time designing, because the rest of the stuff was really, really, really difficult. So that was page 1 of his paper. And on page 2, the same guy said, but this will never work in practice. Nobody ever read past page 1, I think, because page 2 says, this clearly will never work. The way you have to develop software is iteratively. You have to analyze a little, code a little, design a little, code a little, test a little, come back to users, solving my problem, and keep doing this. But he said, but we can't do this today. Because remember, it took a few days to run. It would take years to build something. So back then it didn't work. The iterative approach didn't work because computer technology, language technology, programming technology, software engineering just wasn't there. We are not in 1968. We have all the technologies, all the languages, all the environments to finally work like this. And by the way, we've only had those languages for about 10 to 15 years. It's only now possible that we can do this. So this approach basically is the one that we know works. But we're having a very hard time in organizations to work that way because